Okay, well, thank you for the invitation to speak in this biodiversity speaker series. It's an honor to be the first up, and I look forward to a series of excellent talks throughout the week. So I'm starting off with a talk on Arctic biodiversity, and I've tried to leave this kind of open, so I have a little bit of my research at the end, but also just some kind of broad summaries of Arctic biodiversity um, throughout the presentation. So it should be accessible to people who are a broader audience and also to some people a little more specialized. I study Arctic seabirds, and so you'll hear an awful lot about Arctic seabirds in this presentation. And I think this kind of picture kind of encapsulates what I try and study. And you have here six big-billed murres flying back from the flow edge, and three of them are successful and three of them are unsuccessful. And I think that tells you a little bit about how the ecosystem is doing, whether or not they're successful or not. It tells you a little bit about the broader biodiversity and ecosystem. Okay. I'm going to pretend that the work I'm presenting today is my own work, but really I'm just the figurehead, and there's a lot of people which have helped me along the way, and they do a lot of the work. Two of those people are Alison Patterson, Emily Choi, that have done a lot of the work I'm going to present today, and as well as some of these other students here that have helped me with the Arctic research. And Emily and Alison are working here on the cliff edge. You can see a colony of big-billed murres behind them. They've caught one, and they're gonna put a logger on the bird, find out where it goes, when it what it's doing, and tell us a little bit about the health of that ecosystem. Also, the work that I'm going to present today, the whole presentation is kind of a Western science perspective on Arctic biodiversity, but we work very closely with Inuit. Josiah here, I've worked with now, I think it's the 22nd year that we've been working together. And although I'm going to provide my own perspective, which is a Western science perspective, there are important Inuit perspectives on Arctic biodiversity, of course, and Joe knows more about Arctic biodiversity than I probably ever will. So I just want to acknowledge that there are other viewpoints as well. Okay, so I Googled biodiversity, and this was the first photo that came up. Coral reef with a sea turtle, lots of different fish, lots of coral. And so you might ask yourself, why Arctic biodiversity? When you think of biodiversity, you think of ecosystems like this, right? Tropical rainforests, I don't know, maybe some of the savannas, coral reefs, some of the marine ecosystems. And so I want to try and convince you today that even though Arctic ecosystems have low biodiversity, few species, that they're nonetheless interesting to study and an important part of the global biodiversity. Yeah, so I mean, if you were to look at a map of this, you'd think, well, the Arctic is not worth studying in terms of biodiversity because it's basically a black hole, and we should spend all of our time working on the east slope of the Andes or the Congo rainforest. But in terms of global biodiversity, I think the Arctic and what occurs both poles are really important parts of how the world functions. So in the Arctic, in our ecosystems, there are many fewer species, but the species which there are unique to the poles, and they're really interesting because they're ice-associated. So in contrast to most other ecosystems, which are often anchored by features which are there year-round, we have a very high, seasonal ecosystem in the Arctic, and you have a whole variety of species which are associated with the ice. Here's a diagram here showing some of the key species. You have bowhead whales, which follow the flaw lead into the Arctic every year. You have things like ice-associated phytoplankton, eider ducks, Arctic fox, all these things which require ice year-round. And follow that ice edge as it goes, as it retreats north. I'm also going to point out that, for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to kind of pretend that humans don't exist, or that they're not really part of the ecosystem, but of course they're a really important part of the ecosystem, and very ice dependent. those humans living in these northern environments, often really dependent on the ice, are really dependent on this ecosystem. One reason why I think it's really important to study Arctic biodiversity is because it's one of the most rapidly diminishing habitats on Earth. Here you can see Arctic sea ice extent. So on gray you have the 1981 to 2010 median. The green dotted line is 2012, which was the minimum that's ever been recorded. And you can see in 2023, we're back down there pretty close to the 2012 minimum. And that's been true for basically every year in the last decade. And so we're losing sea ice at a record level. We now have summer sea ice that's close to 50% of what it was even just a couple of decades ago. And as I showed you in that previous slide, all of these species depend on sea ice. And if we lose sea ice, then we'll lose, we're going to lose some of these species. This is also important because Canada has pledged to protect 30% of the Arctic by 2030. I think you'll hear a lot of that this week. One of the things that came out of the COP conference earlier this year is this pledge to protect 30% of the land and waters. And this is especially true in the Arctic. And because as of 2020, there was no protected areas in the Arctic in Canada. And so we have to really rapidly figure out where we want to protect. And this will probably be the places which are protected for the next century. So it's really important that we get that right. And of course, we want to preserve the areas which have high biodiversity. And you can see here in green, this is actually from the World Wildlife Fund, some proposals for areas which are protected, marine habitats which they propose should be protected. And you can see the green covers an awful lot of the Canadian Arctic waters. One of the largest protected areas, I think might be the largest protected areas ever created in Canadian history. Marine protected areas are the two National Marine Conservation Areas, which are outlined in pink there. So we are certainly making progress. Arctic biodiversity is particularly important for McGill because we have an Arctic Research Station. Maybe few of you are familiar with this, but we actually do have a research station at Axel Heiberg. It's one of the most northerly research stations in the world. And here's a picture of it. And there's been a tremendous amount of research which has happened from McGill over the last 60 years that the station's been in existence. And it's a really unique place, a really unique station. Okay. I sometimes think that when people study biodiversity or have a presentation on biodiversity, they basically just talk about viruses, right? Because when you look at all animal diversity, all animal genetic diversity, it's just a little tiny branch off the tree of life of viruses and bacteria. But I don't know anything about that, so I'm not going to talk about that today. But I do want to point out that that Lyle White, who runs the Polar Microbiology Lab, studies nothing but this. He works at the McGill Arctic Research Station, and so we have a fantastic research lab here that studies nothing but microbial diversity in the high north. I'm also not going to talk about arthropods, even though, again, when we think about biodiversity, we often think about insects. You hear about 30 million beetle species and stuff. And there is an awful lot of arthropod diversity in the Arctic. Particularly, there's a lot of diversity of spiders. And Chris Buttle, who is a professor here on campus at works out of the Lyman Museum, just downstairs, literally underneath me here, studies arthropod diversity in the Canadian Arctic. And so I'd encourage you to, if you're interested in that, to come visit the Lyman Museum and talk with Chris about spiders in the Arctic. He can tell you all about the diversity of arthropods in the Arctic. Okay, so I'm just going to have kind of a fun run through of some examples of the diversity which does occur in the Arctic. I thought I'd go through a few different species which occur. Start off with fish. One of the most interesting species for me in terms of fish in the Arctic is the Greenland shark. Perhaps its biggest claim to fame is that it's the longest lived vertebrate. And so Greenland shark can live up to 500 years in the wild. That's absolutely incredible. They seem to do this by having a very, very low metabolic rate. So they just kind of go along and basically at next to zero in terms of their fuel consumption, their metabolic rate. But they do this for a very long time. Greenland shark are common across the Arctic and fished by Inuit and others. Yeah, so kind of a fascinating fish species. A really important species recently is the Greenland halibut, which is a one of the first species which is fished commercial levels in the Arctic. And I think there's a lot of potential to develop fisheries in the Arctic. Many of the communities are looking for ways of developing revenue. And there's been a real increase in halibut fishery across the north. And of course, there's concern about how to develop a sustainable fishery in the north. Another interesting species is Arctic cod. This is the most important fish for Arctic ecosystems. They live in little cracks in the ice. They feed off of under ice algae, and there are tens of billions, hundreds of billions of these fish living across the Arctic, and they're the main food fish for most of the seabirds as well as many of the marine mammals. So if you can think of a polar bear, it's basically just repackaged Arctic cod. Whatever it's feeding on, beluga, ring seal are feeding on Arctic cod. So this is a real keystone species. And we have a lab here headed by Dr. Elliott, who studies the genomics of Arctic fish. And so if you're interested in other Arctic fish, I encourage you to go and learn about his research. Mammals, of course, when we think about Arctic biodiversity, often this is what we're thinking of is mammals, particularly marine mammals. So things like whales, we have beluga whale, narwhal, and bowhead, the three ice-associated whales. Of course, we have a very small population of beluga whales that occurs in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, but most beluga whale populations in Canada are in the Arctic. And there's a large migration of beluga whale into and out of the icebound regions of the Arctic each year. Caribou, we hear an awful lot about caribou in the news. Many caribou populations are threatened, including this Prairie caribou population. So this is Prairie caribou are restricted to the small islands of the Canadian archipelago. It's our smallest caribou species, and the latest in pelage. And so they live off of lichen in the kind of some of the most barest environments, harshest environments possible. I mean, imagine trying to eke out a living in a place and you rely on forage in some place where you only have it's only snow free for 2 months of the year. So they're living in very, very extreme environments. Walrus, so there's some seal species in the Arctic, as well as, of course, the polar bear, which is perhaps the most important predator species, at least one of the predator species that's most important in the public imagination. And we often think of polar bears as feeding exclusively on ring seals. So this is a very simple two species interaction, but polar bears are now expanding their diet because of the difficulty of accessing ring seals, which the ice is disappearing quickly. They're switching to other potential prey items such as walrus, which are increasing in the diet. And then there's a variety of seal species which occur in the Arctic: harp seal, ring seal, hooded seal. The most iconic of those is probably the ring seal. It's the one that you you'll see in National Geographic, which lays its, or which gives birth underneath the ice. It has to have the hole on the surface, and therefore it's really, really dependent on the ice because it needs the ice as a platform to be able to birth their pups. Again, we have two researchers here on this campus that study Arctic marine mammals. This is Melissa McKinney, studies toxic contaminants in marine mammals, and Murray Humphreys that studies them as food sources. And if you're interested in Arctic mammals, I suggest you go and check out their labs. Okay, so the most exciting part of Arctic biodiversity, of course, is the birds. And I'm going to go through some of the bird species which you can find in the Arctic. This, I think birds are some of the most important parts of the biodiversity because they're able to migrate huge distances. So whereas anything else that's in the Arctic, pretty much has to be there year round, has to be able to adapt to really long winters. The birds, of course, can have really long migrations and therefore be able to move out of the Arctic and then take advantage of the summer pulse of energy and resources which are there. One example of a species which can do this is the common eider. This is a really important species for the traditional hunt. Many Inuit use or harvest the down from eiders to be able to produce eider down, which is then sold for a lot of money to create parkas. And it's also harvested for its meat. One of the really interesting things about eiders is that many of them winter in polynyas, and so little gaps in the ice. And you can see here, each of those white dots is an eider living in this polynya and trying to survive there for the winter. So they're really dependent on this shifting ice. And therefore they only occur in areas where there's really strong currents, which keeps the ice open year round. There's several gull species in the Arctic. One of the really interesting one is glaucous gull. They thrive off of they scavenge off of polar bear pills and other dead marine mammals. This means that they have very high levels of toxic contaminants, and so they have some of the highest levels of mercury and PCBs and DDT, which are recorded in any Arctic wildlife. Snow buntings occur across the Arctic. They're circumpolar songbird species. Really, one of the most interesting thing about snow bunting is just how they're able to survive in really, really cold temperatures. And so you can actually bring a snow bunting down to minus 150 degrees Celsius. And that's really, really cold. And they're able to thermoregulate. So they're able to survive at exceptionally cold temperatures. So you can imagine that in the winter, when they first arrive, for instance, in Iqaluit in April, it could be minus 40 outside, and yet it's plus 40 inside. And so there's an 80-degree difference between the layer of feathers. That to me is absolutely incredible that they're able to maintain metabolism at such a small size at such extreme temperatures. There are also several raptor species, one of which is the snowy owl. The snowy owl is recently discovered to be what we call a secret seabird because it actually spends most of its life out on the pack ice hunting seabirds all winter long. So although we see a few of them coming down and spending their winter here in the airport and so forth, most of them are actually way out on the ice all winter long. Here's some research done by a PhD student, Rebecca, as well as an honor student, undergraduate student, Andrea, tracking snowy owls up to the north. And let's see if I can get this to go. Yeah, and so these were birds which were GPS tagged in and around airports in the northern United States and southern Canada. And you can see that basically they just follow the same longitude north and then search out to try and find an area that's rich in lemmings, and that's where they nest. Snowy owls are kind of interesting that year, that way because unlike most raptors, they don't come back to the same site. They will actually move hundreds of kilometers among years to breed at different areas following the lemming cycles. So each year, they arrive in the Arctic, and of course, there's a very short breeding season, so they get there as quickly as possible. And then they have to find out where the lemmings are. So they then scan over hundreds and hundreds of kilometers to find out where there's a peak lemming here that year. Arctic tern is another species with an incredible migration, has the longest migration on record, with some individuals, or all individuals migrating from the Arctic down to the Antarctic, with some individuals going over 30,000 kilometers in a year. Here's a male Arctic tern feeding the female Arctic tern. They do this as a copulatory gift and providing a bit of extra resources to the female. Yeah, I mean, just, kind of amazing, right? I think this little bird is able to migrate distances that, take us, a huge amount of time, even on a jumbo jet. Another ice-associated species is the Manx black guillemot. The Manx black guillemot is a subspecies of the black guillemot that was restricted to Beringia during the last glacial maxima, and has adapted to feeding on Arctic cod and being associated with the ice. And so they require Arctic cod and they require ice in order to be able to breed successfully. Thick-billed murre, you're going to hear more about this species a little later on. So this is the murre with its very large egg. Redneck phalarope. So shorebirds are another set of kind of really intriguing species because they breed in the Arctic, but then they migrate enormous distances to be able to winter in tropical or even southern hemisphere locations. And so you have this redneck phalarope, which is just a few grams in, probably 30 grams, and yet migrates all the way down to winter off of Peru. Another interesting thing about redneck phalaropes is that it's actually the lower bird, which is the male, and the upper bird, which is the female. And so in this species, unlike most birds, it's the female which has the brighter plumage. And this is because the female has multiple male mates, and the male does all of the incubation and rearing of the offspring. So this is the opposite of many other bird species. And so the male has to be able to camouflage in with the nest because he's the one who does all the looking after the all the incubation of the nest. American golden plover, another species which migrates down to the pampas of Argentina. So again, does this in basically 3 migrations, 3 nonstop flights, which is incredible to me that have a bird which is able to migrate from, say, Cambridge Bay to Hudson Bay, and then from Hudson Bay all the way down to northern Brazil, and then from northern Brazil down to Argentina, which are just phenomenal flights for a bird to be able to do. There are a number of sea duck species as well that live in the Arctic and then winter down in our coastal areas. One example is scoter. This is the surf scoter here, and the black scoter that you can see in the background there. Loons, and so most of our loon species breed in the Arctic. The one exception being a common loon, which you hear in the lakes all around Quebec. The other 4 species all breed in the Arctic and then winter in coastal areas. Long-tailed duck. Here, another sea duck which migrates from coastal areas like most in the south up to breeding areas across the Arctic. Okay, so that was a little kind of summary of Arctic biodiversity, just kind of a reminder of some of the amazing species which live in the Arctic, and a little bit about the diversity of species which are there. I'm going to take the last 15 minutes or so to talk about my own research, which is on seabirds' eye into the Arctic biodiversity changes. So in other words, this is about using seabirds as indicators of ecosystem change. Why seabirds? Well, they're colonial. So this means that they're visible and easy to count. They're really easy to work with. In contrast to, say if you wanted to study narwhals, it's really difficult to access. The birds come to us, you go to seabird colony, you're able to access many of them, and they're very easy to locate and count. They're top predators, so everything that's happening across the entire food chain gets kind of integrated into a single signal by the top of the food chain. They forage over large areas, so they're not just telling us a little bit about what's happening here or there, they're telling us what's happening across a large area. And they integrate these signals across space and time, so they tell us something about what's happening over large areas and over large time scales. You can imagine that if you were to look at, for instance, one Arctic cod, it would tell you a little bit what was happening about this, one little area on this one time scale. Whereas if you look at seabirds, they're looking at for a much larger time scale and spatial scale. So what happens here one of the principles here of why we're studying Arctic biodiversity is what happens here impacts us, and we're able to detect here at my field station at Cook's Island in the Canadian Arctic. And so every summer I spend, or my students spend, and I visit them for a little while, several months, living in one of these cabins on Cook's Island, which is uninhabited other than by ourselves, and studying the seabirds and finding out what they're doing. So this was a paper we published a few years ago looking at seabirds as indicators. It's off the Pacific coast, but you could replace any of these with Arctic species. And you can see that by using different seabird species, we're able to understand what's happening in different ecosystems. And by using different tissues, we're able to look at different time scales. And on the top left, you can see, for instance, DDT, which is, to my mind, a real success story. And you can see how DDT, which was once prevalent throughout the world, you detect it in breast milk and Inuit feeding in the in Grise Fjord, our most northern community. We could detect this in the seabirds, which were foraging in very remote locations. But you can see the levels have diminished, and they're now down to kind of basically background levels or very, very low levels of DDT. So it's really a success story. We're able to use the seabirds to be able to show that, yes, this is working. Yes, levels are coming down. You can see the same story with these PBDs, which are flame retardants that were restricted in the mid-2000s. And you can see the levels were increasing steadily throughout the 90s, and then following these restrictions, levels have come back down again. So again, you can see that what we do, what we enact in terms of legislation and policy matters and affects Arctic wildlife. So yeah, basically toxic contaminants make their way into the Arctic. Mercury has increased substantially since the Industrial Revolution, and this is the way that these trends were, these graphs were created, was by looking at levels in eggs, which are collected from seabirds every year. And so somebody descends on a rope, collects the eggs, and brings them back, and they're analyzed in the laboratory to figure out what contaminants are there. And just like I showed you in the other graph there, you can see the levels in various PBD compounds have come up and come back down again. So clear evidence that now we're doing this working. For instance, mercury increased chemicals created from industry in southern North America make their way into the Arctic. But we can reverse those trends. Some chemicals are difficult to develop a consensus, so it's relatively easy to regulate something like DDT, which was created primarily by a single company, and maybe wasn't so valuable to the it was didn't employ tens of thousands of people, tens of millions of people. But other chemicals such as mercury or CO2 are much more difficult to regulate because they have a much stronger impact on ourselves, and therefore, it's much more difficult politically to make those types of changes. I start off this presentation emphasizing that the Arctic is changing, and indeed, sea ice breakup occurs now about 3 weeks earlier in the Arctic than they did 30 years ago, and Arctic ecosystems are warming much faster than anywhere else on Earth. So to try and understand the impact of those climatic changes on biodiversity, I mean, we could go ahead and try and measure everything, or we could try and use indicator species like I'm doing with these seabirds. And I work primarily on a thick-billed murre, which is a species which has small wings and a big body, which is another, one way of saying that they have the highest wing loading of any bird. Because of this means that they're working in a particularly efficient manner. If I asked you to, go get me a sandwich, maybe you'd stop by and chat to somebody, or pick up a coffee along the way. But these birds are working as efficiently as possible, so we can really understand what, what they're telling us about the ecosystem. Probably is a direct reflection of what is actually available there. They also dive to up to 200 meters in depth, and so they're telling us something about the entire water column, not just what's happening on the surface. And I challenge any of you to try and run 200 meters there and back without taking a breath. That's an amazing feat that they're able to do this, hold their breath for 5 minutes, and at the same time be really, really active. There are 2 million breeding pairs of thick-billed murres in Canada, so they're a really important species. They're really abundant. They're harvested. They're important for traditional food systems, and they're just also something that we have a lot of obligation to be able to monitor and make sure that they flourish. Our my research program at Coats Island has been monitoring these birds for 40 years. And the birds every year, we monitor various plots, we report attendance, and we measure how the chicks, how quickly the chicks grow, get an idea of how the population is doing each year. Another thing we do is feeding watches. So we observe what is being fed to the chicks at the colony. And so here you have 2 chicks with the parents there, and they're fed prey, such as this capelin, which the parent is bringing back to feed their chicks. And so this makes them a good system to be able to monitor changes in fish populations, because we can see directly what they're bringing back. And we can see a shift in the mid-1990s in this diet, so what the parents are bringing back to their chicks. Before about 1995, you can see that they were feeding primarily blue, which is Arctic cod, and that was that ice-associated fish, the fish that I said it was probably the most important fish in the Arctic ecosystem. And since then, they've been feeding primarily on red, which is capelin. Capelin is a common species off of Newfoundland, so it seems like at our study site, the ecosystem has switched from being an Arctic ecosystem to being a temperate ecosystem in terms of what fish are available. When the ice leaves earlier and when they're having to feed more capelin and less Arctic cod, then the chicks don't grow as well. You can see that here, that the chick mass is lower in those years when the ice leaves earlier, and so when the breeding season is earlier. So we've seen a switch in the ecosystem from an ice-associated ecosystem like you see on the left here, where you have a lot of Arctic cod, to one on the right there, where there's the same photo from the same location, but no ice. So we've seen this switch from Arctic cod to capelin. So this is what we call a bottom-up change in the diversity. We can also wonder about what's happening in terms of top-down changes. And one of the biggest top-down changes that we've seen is in terms of polar bear predation. You can see here is a chick that has had its head eaten by a polar bear. The bears come through the colony. They seem to primarily focus on the brains, and so they eat the heads off the chicks. In recent years, polar bears have come with increasing frequency onto the colony, and they can be catastrophic in some years when there's a bear on the colony. It can eat through 50% of the colony, and so there'll be a very low productivity in those years. And so why is this happening? The polar bears would almost certainly rather be out on the ice eating ring seals. Ring seal is lipid rich. It's a much better meal than like scrawny murres. But the ice has been progressing, as I mentioned. The ice has been leaving about a month earlier. And so without the ice being present, they're not able to catch seals, and so they're coming on land. and then they're having to find whatever prey they can find on land. They're overlapping with the breeding season of the seabirds. And so with increasing frequency, they're coming onto the land and foraging on seabirds, which is difficult for the seabirds and probably not great for the bears either. Another change which is happening for these birds is increased shipping. Shipping has increased tenfold in the last 20 years in the Arctic. You can see here some important shipping lanes in the Arctic and some areas where there's an awful lot of shipping overlap with seabird colonies. Some of the most important components of this is really large tourist vessels. And so there's a lot more tourism in the Arctic, a lot more vessels associated with the tourism. And many of these vessels want to go see the seabird colonies. It's something to show the tourists. And so this can be, potentially have a negative impact on some of the seabirds, which we're trying to monitor. There's a potential with increased shipping to have oil spills. So far, we've never had a major oil spill in the Arctic. But if there's more and more vessels, then that could eventually happen one day. And MERS are among the most sensitive species to oil spills because they have they're diving into cold water, and so they need to have oil on the feathers all around the body to be able to prevent cold water from entering and getting on the exposed skin. Another really important thing to be thinking about is the connectivity of protected areas, and that these are migratory birds which are moving year round. You can see here that they start off in in the summer they're in at the breeding site there in red, and then in fall they move into Hudson Bay and spend most of the fall in Western Hudson Bay, and then they move out into the North Atlantic during winter, basically just following the ice edge and the moving pack ice year round. If there's no ice, you typically don't find any of these birds. And so any protected area has to be protected. So as we're trying to think about that goal of having 30% of Canada protected by 2030, we need to think about the connectivity of these protected areas. And here are two marine protected areas which are being proposed to protect some of those key habitats. And again, I think about the connectivity. I think we also need to think about the circumpolar perspective and to think about not just what's happening in Canada, but to think about where places are protected elsewhere. This is particularly difficult at the moment because with the war in Ukraine, much of the other side of the Arctic is Russian, and at the moment it's very difficult to have agreements with Russia. Okay, well that's a little bit about what we've been working on in terms of Arctic seabirds. And so I just have a few take-home messages here. Although species numbers are low, Arctic is home to ecosystems that are charismatic and yet threatened. Seabirds are among the most visible and abundant groups in the Arctic and are indicators for biodiversity change. And seabirds tell us about changing Arctic ecosystems and threats from chemical and oil pollution. Thank you for your time.